My foster parents treated me like crap, so I obliterated their reputation in our small town. My parents passed away in a hit-and-run car accident when I was 10 years old. My dad was only 39 and my mom 35. Neither of my parents had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small, church-going town where everyone knew each other. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune and so I didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big cities, so him and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go the orphanage route when they passed, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringe-worthy like that. The Banks family had their own daughter Ella, who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends, but Ella had her own thing going and always ignored me. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my parents' inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in our small town. In front of other people they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Ella be nice to me in public, which she hated. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come, and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on anything they ever wanted. Nice dinners, vacations, etc. It was clear to me even as a teen that the Banks family were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest, they spent on themselves. As I grew older, I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen and that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is an event and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Ella. When I was 17, I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Ella's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the Banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them and that once I got control of my inheritance, that I should be godly and generous and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got lots of material. Especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store and kept them for herself, gave them to Ella, or to her other relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive, Baroque-era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten the steak off those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how this china set will go to Ella on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy, I didn't care for all my mom's antiques that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, that I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things were just things, and never obsess over them. So, having the frou-frou china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away, which is so wrong. So, once Ella went off to college, thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. Per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were telling me about how I owed them compensation and since I was going to be rich soon I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years they probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused.